3 years. One peninsula. Between 2 and 5 million people dead, most of them civilians. And when it was over, it did not end. There was no peace treaty. Technically, it is still going on. But here is the strangest part. Ask 5 different countries what that war was, and you get 5 different answers, starting with its name. In South Korea, it is 625, a date. In North Korea, it is the Fatherland Liberation War. In China, it is the War to Resist America and Aid Korea. In America, it is the Forgotten War. And in Japan, it barely has a name at all because Japan would rather not remember its role. Same 3 years, same dead, 5 completely different wars. Let's begin with what is not seriously disputed by historians. At dawn on June 25, 1950, the Army of North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. We know this, not only from Western records, but from Soviet archives opened after 1991, which show the invasion was planned in Pyongyang and approved in Moscow. Within days, the South nearly collapsed. The United States, under a United Nations flag, intervened. 21 countries sent forces. Then, as UN troops pushed north toward the Chinese border, China entered, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Yalu River. The war seesawed up and down the peninsula, destroying nearly every major city, until the lines froze almost exactly where they began, at the 38th parallel. On July 27, 1953, the two sides signed an armistice. A ceasefire, not a peace. No treaty was ever signed. The border became the most militarized on Earth. Those are the facts almost everyone accepts. Now watch what each nation builds on top of them. For South Korea, the war has a name that is also an accusation. 625. The date the North invaded. The name itself says they started it. They came across the line at dawn without warning. In Korean classrooms, this is the war of survival. The moment the young republic almost died in its 3rd year and was saved. It is also the war that made the division permanent and personal. Around 10 million Koreans were separated from their families. Grandparents died, never knowing whether a son or a sister on the other side was alive. And it is the root of South Korea's deepest political fault line, the fear of the North, and the fierce anti-communism that shaped the country for generations. For South Korea, the war is not history. It is an open wound that runs straight through the middle of the peninsula and through the middle of countless families. Now cross the 38th parallel, and the story does not just change, it inverts. In North Korea, the war is called the Fatherland Liberation War, and the official history teaches that it began the opposite way, that the United States and the South invaded the North, and that North Korea heroically drove them back. This is not what the archives show. The evidence that the North attacked first is overwhelming. But in North Korea, that does not matter, because this war is not a historical event. It is the founding myth of the state. The entire legitimacy of the ruling family rests on it. The story of a leader who defeated the most powerful empire on Earth and saved the nation. That is why North Korea marks July 27th, the day the fighting stopped, with no winner, as Victory Day. When a nation's rulers depend on a version of the past, that version does not bend to evidence. It becomes law. For China, the war has yet another name, the War to Resist America and Aid Korea. Notice what that name does. It is not a war against Korea. It is a war against America, fought on Korean soil. In 1950, the People's Republic of China was 1 year old. Exhausted poor, just emerged from decades of civil war and Japanese occupation, and it chose to send its soldiers against the army of the world's most powerful nation. More than 2 million Chinese troops crossed the Yalu. Nearly 200,000 did not come home. Among the dead was Mao Anying, the eldest son of Mao Zedong himself, and China did not lose. It fought the United States to a standstill. For China, this is the nation-founding war. The moment the humiliated, invaded China of the previous century stood up, faced the strongest power on Earth, and did not break. It is the bookend to the century of humiliation we saw in Nanjing. That was China at its lowest. This was China standing up. Now cross the Pacific to the country that fought hardest to forget. In the United States, more than 36,000 Americans died in Korea, and yet Americans call it the Forgotten War. How does a country forget a war that killed 36,000 of its own? Look at what came before and after. Before Korea was the Second World War, the Good War, with a clear enemy, a total victory, and parades. After Korea came Vietnam, the war that tore America apart. Korea sat in between. A war with no clear victory, no surrender, no parade. It ended where it started, in a stalemate no one could turn into a triumph. A nation can build a memory around a victory, and even around a defeat. But an inconclusive war, fought to a draw and frozen forever. That is the hardest kind to hold, so America mostly set it down. The Forgotten War was not forgotten because it was small. It was forgotten because it did not fit the story America likes to tell about itself. And now, the strangest memory of all, Japan. Japan did not send soldiers. Japan had no army. It was still under American occupation. In Japanese, the war is simply the Korean War, a neighbor's tragedy across the sea. But that neighbor's tragedy is one of the reasons Japan is rich today. When the war began, occupied Japan became the rear base for the entire UN war effort. Its factories, ports, and railways supplied the front. Orders poured in for trucks, for blankets, for shells, for everything a war consumes. Historians call it the special procurement boom. By 1955, it had brought Japan around $3.5 billion and pulled its collapsing post-war economy back from the edge. Companies that would become global giants were rebuilt on those wartime orders. In 1956, the government declared the post-war period is over, so Japan remembers this war the least and has the most uncomfortable reason to. Just 5 years after its empire fell, Japan was rebuilt by a war on the very peninsula it had once colonized. The destruction of one Korea became the recovery of the country that used to rule it. Some memories are quiet, not because they are small, but because they are hard to look at. Across this series, we've studied disputes where the facts themselves are tangled, where two countries can each point to a real treaty, a real map, a real claim. Korea is different. Here, the central fact is not seriously in question. The archives are clear about who crossed the line first, and yet, 5 nations remember 5 different wars, not because they disagree about what happened, but because they need the war to mean 5 different things. China needs a founding victory. North Korea needs a defensive myth. South Korea needs a story of survival. America needs to look away. Japan needs to not look too closely. This is the hardest truth in the whole series. Even when the facts are settled, memory refuses to settle because a nation does not remember a war to record it. It remembers a war to explain itself, to say, this is who we are, and this is why. Memory is not a photograph of the past. It is a role we hand the past, so the present makes sense. And once you see that, you can never again read a history textbook from any country, including your own, without asking, what does this nation need this story to mean? The Korean War never ended. The guns fell silent in 1953, but no peace was ever signed. The soldiers still face each other across the same line. The families are still divided, and the 5 stories still run, side by side, never touching. 1 war, 5 names, 5 memories, and not one of them is simply a lie. If you can hold all 5 in your mind at once, the survival, the myth, the victory, the forgetting, and the quiet prophet, without collapsing them into one, then you have learned what this channel exists to teach. Next time on Unlearn, we go north to a chain of cold, wind-scoured islands that Japan and Russia have argued over for 80 years, and the reason the two nations have never, to this day, signed a treaty ending the Second World War. The Kuril Islands. See you then.